if you guys signed, I don't know, what's the number for you guys? 40 million?
300 million.
300?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's just not into anything. 300? Maybe 300. Okay, I bet.
Yeah, 9 figures.
Okay.
Welcome back to the channel, guys. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to break down Joe Rogan's new $250 million Spotify deal, and straight off the bat, it is a very different deal to his previous one, even though this new one is reportedly worth around the same as the old one. This time around, the whole $250 million is not guaranteed, whereas previously it was. So stick around because I'm going to make it crystal clear for all of you and explain why both Spotify and Rogan have failed. But first, a massive shout out to my 106,000 subscribers. Even after we hit 100k, we're still going strong, so if you haven't jumped on board yet, now is the time to do it. You don't want to miss out on my uploads. There's usually a few every week, so hit the subscribe button and become a regular viewer. I also just want to say the only commentary I've seen on this new Spotify deal so far is a whole bunch of sheep saying how Joe Rogan beat the woke mob and how they couldn't cancel him. People are trashing the activist employees who tried to have JRE pushed off Spotify. And look, that's fine. I'm there for that too. But I just find it frustrating how there's a massive gaping hole when it comes to original thoughts and coverage of these topics. So this video is not that. I'm actually going to take you through the details of the deal and give you my thoughts and opinions on why this deal isn't a good deal, why Spotify did it, and why Rogan pretty much had to accept it.
So now it's oversaturated. And especially in the past year, the podcast bubble burst. The Spotify deals, they lost their ass. Not on Rogan. They saved their ass on Rogan. They're lucky they signed Joseph Rogan. And Rogan and I will argue about this. I don't give a fuck. He got underpaid. You look at the valuation of their stock and how much that company is worth now because they signed Rogan compared to what they paid him. You know, I'm a shark when it comes to business. They underpaid my man. They underpaid. He should got paid a lot more. All good. That's his thing. You know, I would done the deal. I'm just saying, you look how much that company is evaluated now, and then you look at the money they tossed, the Obamas, that woke boy, what's his name? Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Yeah. You look at all these shows that and the other shows I'm fan of, so I won't say them. They've all lost their on that, except for Joseph Rogan. They could have taken that money and just put it towards him, you know, and signed a longer deal because his deal's up soon.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I think it was a 3-year deal.
Let's start by recapping Rogan's previous Spotify deal so that we're all on the same page. That one was a straight-up exclusivity contract, which simply meant Spotify was paying Joe around $200 million in total over 4 years for the exclusive rights to his podcast. I covered this in detail in a previous video titled Should Joe Rogan Retire, so go and check that out for the full breakdown, but in a nutshell, under that deal, Rogan would produce JRE episodes and upload them to Spotify, and he would be responsible for his own advertising and ad reads and all of that stuff. Maybe a better way of looking at it is Spotify was paying Rogan $200 million over 4 years not to publish his podcast anywhere else. That's obviously what exclusive means. Sure, he's still got his YouTube channel with over 16 million subscribers where he posts, those shorter clips from each episode to send traffic over to Spotify, but other than that, you would have to go over to Spotify to see a full episode. I should mention that last year when he had Elon Musk on the podcast with the Cybertruck, 2 hours of that episode was uploaded to X as well, and people were speculating that Rogan was going to move over to X after his Spotify deal ended, and that was sort of like a test run, but as I suggested at the time, that didn't happen. Now, without going into the reasons why just yet, my immediate reaction is that Joe's old Spotify deal was way better than this one is. I mean, basically, it's night and day. But we'll get there because my regulars know I like to put all the pieces of the puzzle together first, so let's do that then. What is this new deal all about? Well, there are 2 main features. Firstly, JRE will no longer be exclusive to Spotify once it starts. JRE episodes will be available in full across Apple Podcast, Amazon, and back on YouTube as well. Secondly, unlike his previous deal, Rogan is not guaranteed the $250 million in this new deal. He'll get a minimum guarantee up front, but the rest of the money will come from a revenue sharing arrangement based on ad sales. Now, Joe isn't the only one on this new type of contract with Spotify. The second biggest Spotify exclusive podcast, Call Her Daddy, with Alex Cooper, has also switched over to the same deal, although it's probably not worth $250 million, as you can imagine. So some of you are probably thinking, okay, cool, Rogan signed a new deal with Spotify, who cares? Well, this is true, but what if I told you that this new deal is different to the old one because both Spotify and Rogan failed? Let me explain. Remember last year how Steven Crowder and Daily Wire had that public falling out over deal negotiations to bring Louder with Crowder over to their platform? Well, that deal was basically the same as this one, just with smaller numbers. Basically, Daily Wire would pay Crowder $50 million over 4 years to produce his show, so that's $12.5 million per year, and he would cover the production costs out of his cut, and Daily Wire would manage the distribution, ad sales, and all of the business side. But Crowder turned it down. Not just because of the money, but because of a little clause that he didn't like. It said that if any of Crowder's episodes were demonetized by YouTube, for example, which has happened before, then Daily Wire would not have to pay him for those episodes. Effectively, he would be working for free, much like if he owned his own show and was monetizing it himself. And this is where things get interesting for Rogan, but I'm going to come back to that because I want to explain why I think Rogan and Spotify did this new deal differently in the first place.
What do you think the future of that is with Spotify?
Well,
Because Spotify's firing people like crazy.
they're making more money now. They're saving money.
So that you think they invested all the money in terms of to gain market share. Now they have market share and they're like, okay, we don't need to invest as much in private.
They're going to do a little bit more content, but I think at this point, they're just trying to find ways to make revenue, right? I think their new thing, because now they're the number one in podcast listening, they're going to probably try to incite and offer to people who they don't have to pay exclusive contracts to and be like, hey, listen, we have a monetization strategy where you can do ads for us. They
So
do
just
it now.
like YouTube. They're trying to compete with YouTube.
Yeah, no, of course.
The first thing that stands out is the non-exclusive distribution to all platforms. That tells me two things. Number one, Rogan lost a whole bunch of listeners when he left YouTube for Spotify, and number two, Spotify wasn't making enough money off of JRE to justify giving him another exclusivity contract. Think about it. The only reason why Spotify and Rogan would agree to drop the exclusivity arrangement is because they want to reach a broader audience. If Spotify had managed to capture the bulk of the podcasting audience around the world, there would be no need to distribute to other platforms, but they obviously need to do it now because they're not making enough ad revenue just on Spotify alone to justify such a big contract with Joe Rogan. And that's also partly Rogan's fault too. He obviously wasn't able to migrate his audience over to Spotify and keep it growing, and what I suspect has happened is that both Joe and Spotify have agreed that podcasting in general has reached its saturation point and the numbers are starting to go backwards. Therefore, to maintain their relationship, they both had to agree to reach a broader audience. Spotify fail, Rogan fail. My other question is, who owns the IP now? Is it still Rogan and JRE or is it Spotify? Because remember, as part of this new deal, Spotify is responsible for distributing the podcast and selling ad space. So I suspect Rogan will just license JRE to Spotify with a whole bunch of conditions, so there's probably nothing to really worry about here. I'm sure Rogan's got some decent lawyers doing all of this for him, and it's not just him and Jamie fumbling their way through the contract with a dictionary and Google. But don't be mistaken, Joe has basically given control of his podcast to Spotify for a fee. I mean, Spotify has basically become a podcast network now, right? Why? Why don't they just stick to music and do that better than everybody else? Now they're doing exactly what Podcast One does, for example, and look how it's turned out for them so far. And so hopefully by now you're asking the question, well, you know what? Rogan could just do all of this himself, right? I mean, why does he need Spotify to do all that distribution for him? I mean, everything's digital. It's not like back in the old Hollywood system where the big studios owned the movie theaters and controlled every aspect of production, marketing, and distribution. It would literally be Jamie uploading each episode onto a podcast hosting site and the RSS feed spitting out the podcast to all of the platforms. I mean, that's how everyone else does it. So why do this with Spotify just so he can make this minimum upfront guarantee, which he would have made 10 times over by just doing it himself? I think, honestly, it's mostly ego. If he left Spotify, the perception would be that he failed. The relationship soured and the rumor mill would have been in overdrive. Imagine how happy CNN and the New York Times, Washington Post, and all of those establishment hack publishers would be if Rogan and Spotify parted ways for Rogan to go out on his own again. The headlines would be, Spotify cancels Joe Rogan. But the reality would be, Joe just said, screw you guys, I'm going home. I'm just going to do this on my own again. But I also think it's more than that. You see, Rogan wants to be the guy with the deal. If you look at Tom, Bert, Schultz, Shane, Tim, Bobby, etc., none of Joe's buddies have big deals with a major platform. Rogan was the guy who got the deal. And I think he likes that. I think he likes dipping his toes in the mainstream pool while still maintaining his independent, free speech warrior facade. And don't forget how much Rogan used to look up to Howard Stern. I mean, when it comes to broadcasting deals, nobody comes close to Howard Stern's $500 million multi-year deal. The guy's been earning $100 million a year for like 15 years. It's insane. And we know Rogan's very competitive. Don't forget, Howard Stern thinks podcasters are losers. There's definitely a beef there, even though they're old friends. Joe's never spoken badly of Stern. He still holds him in high regard. And I think that plays a big part in Joe's thinking when it comes to making these kinds of deals. He wants to be known as the deal guy of podcasting, just like Howard Stern is the deal guy of broadcasting.
You're upset with Howard Stern because he said that about podcasting.
That's the new thing I'm upset with Howard Stern over. It just shows how much he's lost touch. Like, that's not the way you become a radio DJ. Stern, no one wants to become a radio DJ who's doing podcasts. That's not our end goal. He said this for losers. So that means anyone who listens to a podcast and listens to Howard Stern, just so you know, Howard Stern called you a loser for listening to podcasts as well.
Oh, no, man. I hear that from a guy like that. He's too clever.
He was too clever.
I think he's probably, I don't know. I think he's probably with people.
So then let's take a step back and look at this from the big picture perspective for a moment, because here is my hot take. Okay, Rogan should have done this himself. He doesn't need Spotify. They tried to use his podcast as the breeding ground for a podcasting ecosystem, and they failed. We know about all the deals they cancelled with Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the Obamas. They overpaid so many different podcasters, and they weren't able to recoup their losses. So now they're basically taking JRE and Call Her Daddy and monetizing them everywhere. That's seriously it. So when I put it like that, it sounds stupid, right? And you could say, okay, sure, but doing it yourself would require more work, more responsibility, and more risk. But that's what Rogan's been doing up until now anyway. He's the one with the relationships with all of the sponsors that he does all the ad reads for, not Spotify. So now they're actually making the real change, because Spotify will now take over all of those relationships and manage all of the ad revenue across all platforms. And similar to Crowder, the big problem will come when Rogan's content gets demonetized by one or more of the platforms that Spotify distributes to.
You did it so long yourself, and then Spotify's under a ton of pressure. Like, didn't they delete some of your episodes?
Yeah, they did that, and they also were very apprehensive about certain guests that I had on, and there was, a lot of pressure from advertisers. There was a lot of pressure from different people.
So where does that lead to? Well, it leads to the inevitable conversation with Spotify where they sit Joe down and give him the talk. This is how it goes. Joe, we're losing money on advertising because of the things you're saying on the podcast and some of the guests you're having on there. If we can't make money off the show, then it's just not worth it for us. Because remember, they're not building their podcasting audience anymore. All of that's gone out the window. Now they're just trying to make money, and in this space, money is all about advertising. So if you can't advertise for whatever reason, then Spotify will inevitably turn to Joe and say, hey, I thought you were a numbers guy, B. What are we doing here? We're going to have to start approving each episode and censoring anything that isn't ad-friendly. And then, in one swift stroke of the pen, everything Rogan stood for just went out the window. But let's just see what happens. We know that all the deleted episodes after the N-word controversy were removed at Rogan's request, and Spotify is known for shaking their head at censorship, but now it's different. Now they're in the driver's seat. Having said all of that, I'd be surprised if Rogan didn't address this pretty soon in one of his podcasts. He never really shies away from this stuff, and he's always been pretty open and honest about his relationship and dealings with Spotify. But yeah, everyone's happy until they start losing money, right? Anyway, that's my breakdown of Rogan's new Spotify deal. I hope you enjoyed it because all I've seen, like I said at the beginning, is commentary and analysis about how Rogan is still the man and how he beat the woke mob, he's uncancelable, etc., etc. I haven't seen anyone make a serious attempt to go over the actual details and consider why this deal is just so different to the previous one. So make sure you guys drop a comment below. Let me know what you think about all of this. Maybe I've missed something or you want to challenge me on something I said. But remember, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get all my uploads right there in your feed. That's it from me. I'll catch you in the next one.
Bro, we've been doing this since 2009. Isn't it crazy at the beginning when we first started doing it, everybody's like, what the f*** are you doing? We tried a few different versions of like this idea that we could just stream stuff and have fun. It was just, but that's, I think, why it worked. Because it was all just fun. Like, no one ever thought it was going to be a business.
Yeah.